What you're about to hear was never meant for public ears. The documents were sealed, the witnesses silenced, and the graves left unmarked. But history has a way of rotting through its own coffin. And tonight, you will learn the secret they buried in the Appalachian Mountains, the family that should have never existed. Imagine this. You're standing on a dirt road at the edge of West Virginia wilderness. No houses, no voices, only the sound of your own breath fogging in the night air. Before you, an abandoned farmhouse crouches like a corpse of wood and stone, the roof sagging, the windows hollow. And yet, the moment you step closer, you feel it, a vibration in the air, like the house itself is still breathing. Locals won't come here. They tell their children the stories, but they refuse to speak of the truth. They call it cursed. They call it the property of the devil. But the papers, the ones hidden in the state archives for decades, tell another story, one far darker than any ghost tale. This is not fiction. This is not myth. This is a documented cold case. A family so corrupted by one man's obsession with bloodline purity that 7 daughters became 7 wombs for their father's empire of inbreeding. A bloodline cultivated in secret, hidden for generations, and scattered like a virus across America. And here's the truth. Once you hear this, you cannot go back to innocence. You cannot unknow what happened inside the Blackwood house. The story begins in 1903, when a man named Thomas Blackwood appeared in Westland County with a pocket full of untraceable cash and a family that looked wrong. His wife, Martha, 7 daughters, aged 4 to 16. They purchased nearly 500 acres of untouched wilderness. Cash, no questions asked. The locals assumed it was just another self-reliant family escaping industrial America. But Thomas was not escaping. He was building. He spoke little, worked alone, carried iron stoves and heavy beams up the mountain roads by himself, though no man alive could have lifted such loads unaided. The store clerks wrote notes in their ledgers. How does he do it? Who helps him? Why does no one see the girls? Even the postman heard whispers of women crying from the barns at night, voices disguised as livestock. But in small towns, questions rot in silence. By winter of 1908, the silence cracked. A doctor was summoned in the middle of a snowstorm for what was said to be Martha Blackwood's difficult childbirth. But when Dr. Samuel Porter arrived, it was not Martha in labor. It was Catherine, the eldest daughter, 21 years old, terrified, and according to the doctor's examination, not her first pregnancy. Porter's notes remain some of the most chilling in medical history. He wrote of Catherine trembling when her father entered the room, shrinking as if he were a predator rather than protector. He wrote of the 6 other daughters, pregnant or near it, peering from the shadows of the hall like prisoners who knew rescue would never come. And when the doctor tried to speak, Thomas Blackwood's warning was sharp. Your duty is to the patient, not to morality. You must understand the psychology here. This was not a man acting in secret shame. He believed in his doctrine. He wrote later in his journals that God himself had chosen him to preserve the world through his blood. A new Genesis, a purified humanity. And his daughters, no, his breeding stock, were the vessels of his empire. The sheriff came once. He stayed only long enough to write a 3-sentence report. He declared the family private but not in distress, and yet his re-election campaign was fattened by Blackwood's money. Do you see the pattern already? Power buys silence. The sheriff was bought. The clerk was bought. Even the church accepted donations to stop asking questions. The corruption was not hidden. It was simply tolerated. And while the world marched into modernity, telephones ringing, cars rolling across cities, radios humming with news, the Blackwood daughters remained locked in a time capsule of isolation, their bodies chained to one man's vision of a perfect bloodline. By 1910, a hunter stumbled upon graves in the forest. 11 of them, some small, child-sized, no names, no markers, just wooden crosses. When he reported it, the sheriff replied, "What a family does on their land is their business." This is how evil breeds, not just through the monster at the center, but through the silence of everyone who looks away. And this silence lasted for decades, but not everyone was blind. One daughter, the youngest, Elizabeth, would one day smuggle letters to a traveling Bible salesman. Her words cut through history like knives. Father says the outside world is corrupt, that we are God's chosen. When each sister turns 13, she must fulfill her divine purpose in the East Wing. Mother tried to stop him once. He locked her in the cellar until she never spoke again. The letters told of infants born with sickness, buried in the unmarked graves, of surviving children raised to breed again when they turned of age, and of a horrifying plan for Thomas's grandsons to continue his work with their mothers and sisters, a cycle of corruption disguised as purity. Think about that. Generation after generation, not just abused but indoctrinated, raised in a doctrine where incest was holy, where bloodlines must never dilute, where the apocalypse was coming and only they would inherit the earth. Do you see the shape of this horror? This was not just a family tragedy. This was a system, a machine of psychological control, and Thomas Blackwood had no intention of letting it die with him. This was the seed, and from this seed, corruption would spread. What you've heard so far is only the surface. The Blackwood file goes deeper, darker, and more dangerous. But before we continue, pause for one moment. Look into yourself. Ask, why am I hearing this now? Perhaps because the world we live in today is built on the same silence, the same corruption, the same machinery of control. And once you see it here, in one family's nightmare, you will begin to see it everywhere. This is your descent, and the fall has only just begun. The first rule of power is this: if you can control what people believe, you no longer need chains. Their minds will lock themselves. Thomas Blackwood understood this. He didn't simply abuse his daughters, he rewrote their reality. Imagine being born into a world where the only voice of authority is your father. No teachers, no neighbors, no friends, just one man. He decides what is holy, what is evil, and what your body is for. And if you resist, you are buried with the others in the nameless graves. Elizabeth Blackwood's letters reveal the inner mechanics of this prison. They're not the words of a rebellious teenager, but of a prisoner who had been carefully conditioned and yet still found fragments of will to resist. She wrote, "When each sister reaches 13, Father says we must step into the East Wing. He calls it consecration. He says the blood must remain pure, that God has spoken it to him. He tells us the world outside has fallen, that only our line will endure after the fire." Notice the genius of this delusion. He weaponized religion, not the religion of Scripture, but his own doctrine, written in fever and paranoia. He replaced the Bible with his journal. He told them the apocalypse was near, that they were chosen, that everyone outside their walls was corrupt. This is the classic architecture of control: isolation, fear of the outside, exaltation of the abuser. Every cult in history follows this same blueprint. But in the Blackwood case, the cult was not hundreds of strangers. It was his own blood. The daughters did not just revere their captor, they were forced to carry his seed. They were made to believe that their abuse was divine duty, and once that belief takes root, even the unthinkable becomes ordinary. This is how generational corruption sustains itself, through doctrine, through lies told so consistently that truth itself dissolves. Elizabeth's words grew darker with each letter. She described infants who were stillborn, or born twisted, sickly, unable to breathe. She called it the sickness from father's blood. And yet, each death was not treated as tragedy, but as sacrifice, a necessary cost for God's chosen lineage. She wrote, "Father says the weak are taken by God, that only the strong remain. He says the graves in the woods are proof that we are becoming more perfect." Do you see the horror? This wasn't madness alone. It was a belief system designed to rationalize suffering. Every scream, every groan, every broken body became fuel for the doctrine. To the daughters, it was no longer abuse. It was destiny. But Elizabeth's final letter is the most chilling. "Father prepares my nephew for the sacred duty. He is 16 next year. He says the bloodline must continue, even if he is taken from us. I cannot allow this. I will try to escape. If you do not hear from me by May, alert the state, not the sheriff. He has been paid for silence." That was the last anyone heard from her. No more letters, no escape, only silence. Ask yourself, what happened to Elizabeth? Was she caught and buried with the others? Did she vanish into the forests? Or did Thomas make an example of her so the others would never think of rebellion again? The records fall silent, and that silence itself speaks louder than any testimony. But here's where the story grows even darker. When state investigators finally reached the property in 1915, they found the infamous East Wing, a locked chamber. Inside, a bed draped in white, walls covered in handwritten scripture, not from the Bible, but from Thomas's fevered imagination, his words scratched across the walls like commandments. On the crude altar, they found his journal, 12 years of meticulous notes, a breeding schedule, fertility tracking, observations on which pairings produced stronger offspring. Do you understand what that means? This was not random abuse. This was a program, a system, a deliberate experiment in genetic control. And here is the part you are not supposed to realize. What Thomas Blackwood was doing in secret mirrors what empires and institutions have done in the open. Selective breeding, a controlled reproduction, eugenics, the shaping of humanity through manipulation of bloodlines. He was not an outlier. He was a grotesque echo of larger forces already at work in his time. By the early 1900s, America itself was experimenting with forced sterilizations, purity laws, and the pseudoscience of eugenics. Institutions justified it with the same language Thomas used: cleansing, perfection, survival of the fittest. The difference? Blackwood did it in a farmhouse with his daughters. Governments did it with laws, clinics, and gas chambers. Do you see the parallel now? One man in the mountains and entire nations were running the same experiment to bend humanity into their vision of purity. This is why I tell you, the Blackwood family is not just a horror story of incest. It is a mirror. It shows you how control is exercised, first in a family, then in a community, then in a nation. The same architecture scales up, and the silence of those around, the sheriff, the community, the church, is no different than the silence of entire populations who look away when institutions do the same. And here's the deeper cut. If you can understand how one man enslaved his bloodline with doctrine, fear, and isolation, you can also understand how elites enslave populations today. Different stage, different costume, same script. But here is where I ask you to pause. Right now, I want you to go to the comments and write this phrase, not once, but twice. The bloodline ends with me. Write it twice, because repetition is how belief takes root. Do it to mark the moment you step out of silence. Do it as a declaration that you will not carry corruption forward, not in your blood, not in your mind. Because the truth is this, the Blackwood nightmare was not buried in 1915. It spread, it multiplied, and the more you learn, the more you will see that corruption never dies. It evolves. In the next descent, we will uncover what investigators found after the family vanished, the maps, the hidden properties, and the scattered communities that carried his doctrine across America like a contagion. The story is not over. It has only grown stronger in the shadows, and you are about to see just how deep the bloodline goes. When the Blackwood house fell silent, it did not end the story. It scattered it. What the investigators found after that first forensic sweep in 1915 was less a conclusion and more a beginning. A map, not a treasure map, but a ledger of lies and identities. On brittle paper, folded inside a rented safety deposit box that would not be opened until 1946, were the coordinates of escape routes and new names, a spiderweb of small holdings across 4 states, and instructions for resurrecting the same closed world under different flags. That discovery is where the horror stops being a single family's nightmare and becomes a calibrated strategy for survival. You must understand what a safety deposit box represents. It is a bank's promise of secrecy, a place to hide what you do not want traced back to you. Thomas Blackwood used that promise like ink on the map of his empire. In that box, investigators later found deeds purchased under aliases, correspondence showing cash transfers, and lists lists naming daughters under different surnames, listing children relocated with fake birth records, noting the towns where new fences and private wells would make discovery difficult. The man who burned his conscience in the name of purity planned, with bureaucratic diligence, how to survive the law. Think about the logistics. To raise dozens of children in isolation across distant rural properties requires more than fanaticism. It requires money, it requires falsified documents, and it requires a system of mutual silence. Blackwood didn't act as a lone predator in a single den. He established colonies, and he taught them the same doctrine: distrust the outside, sanctify the abuse, keep the mark. The mark, the old women later whispered, was a symbol sewn into garments, a private sigil to identify a true lineage. It sounds like myth because it was designed to sound like myth, a ritual that binds identity to obedience. By the time the Federal Task Force in 1975 dug into the trail, the network had become a patchwork of isolated pockets, families with the same telltale patterns: limited education, secretive births, a warped theology passed down not through ministers but through bedtime commands. Medical teams documented striking genetic similarities among many of those they found: facial traits repeating like a cruel family brand, congenital disorders, stunted development, a vocabulary of trauma taught as doctrine. This was not simply the slow creep of poverty, it was the measurable outcome of deliberate reproductive control. The children born in those houses bore the physical signatures of a program meant to purify, but which instead debased. And yet, even with those facts, the investigation stalled in places. Why? Because the infrastructure of secrecy is not just made of hidden boxes and forged names. It's built into human complacency and institutional convenience. County clerks remembered ledger entries and shrugged. Local judges had been favored by Blackwood's donations. Clergy accepted tithes. Rural clinics took money. People who benefited, directly or indirectly, found reasons to disbelieve or to explain away the obvious. This is economic complicity. It is pragmatic silence disguised as moral ambiguity. And it is the most reliable ally of any person who wishes to hide a monstrous truth. The federal teams that arrived in the 1970s were not naive. They knew the patterns. Still, the deeper they cut, the more the edges were sutured by old omissions. Files had been sealed. Witnesses had died, or they had been moved. Entire branches of what should have been a demographic anomaly were intentionally obfuscated through name changes, adoption records altered, even orphanages complicit in reassignments. In one case file, an adoption certificate was stamped with a county clerk's approval, the signature faint but legible, while a note in the margin recorded a cash payment. The investigators called it corruption. The truth was worse. It was a system that made the family's survival possible. What the forensic social workers found among the rescued was a population that had been shaped by generational cognitive captivity. They had been taught to read Thomas Blackwood's journal as scripture. They had been inoculated with myths that turned abuse into honor. They carried rituals that only they understood, secret mealtime prayers, songs, and the sigil sewn into hems. Some older survivors spoke of being taught that the rest of the world was decayed, and that marrying cousins, uncles, even their own children was a sacred duty to continue the work. When the authorities tried to prosecute, many defendants were legally incompetent to stand trial, not because they were necessarily incapable of understanding law, but because their entire moral map had been rearranged since birth. Listen to that carefully. You cannot easily punish people whose inner compass has been flipped. The law can arrest bodies, it can freeze assets, it can lock doors, but what do you do with minds that have been trained to accept atrocity as salvation? Rehabilitation becomes the only hinge that can open the future, and it is painstaking, expensive, and painfully imperfect. Some survivors were placed with foster families, taught to read outside the doctrine that had shaped them. Others required institutional care, and some, stubborn, scarred, and silent, returned to the small communities where the doctrine lingered like smoke. There is another element here that history rarely admits: the multiplicative effect of secrecy. When you conceal an atrocity, you do not merely protect the perpetrator, you create a market for deceit. Medical professionals who accepted cash for silence, clerks who falsified records, ministers who turned away, they became accomplices, sometimes knowingly, sometimes because it was simply easier to accept the money and live with the shadow. Social institutions, when corrupted, become engines that replicate the harm they were meant to prevent. And even after the task force's limited successes, the rescue of dozens, the identification of dozens more, the spectre of Blackwood did not vanish. Reports surfaced of similar family patterns in far-flung states: Oregon, Arizona, Tennessee, small pockets where the signs matched too closely to be coincidence, but chasing those leads required resources, political will, and an appetite for discomfort that institutions rarely sustain. There is always a cost to digging, and there is always someone ready to pay you to look away. Sometimes that person is a politician. Often, it is an entire culture conditioned to prioritize peacekeeping over justice. So what remains? A map of folded paper and a scattering of broken lives, a doctrine inscribed in journals that read like a manual for violence disguised as salvation, a network that once spanned multiple states under aliases and prudent secrecy, and a lesson that cannot be overstated. When you institutionalize silence, you create a seedbed for horror that will sprout in many places, under many names. You must see the architecture now: secrecy, doctrine, money, complicity, and the stubborn human tendency to create moral economies that justify silence. Thomas Blackwood's enterprise survived because every part of that architecture pulled in the same direction. To uproot such a machine, you don't merely arrest a man, you have to dismantle the economies of silence that keep it fed. And that is precisely what the rest of this descent will show you. How systems hide behind ritual, how power launders its sins through bureaucracy, and how the ripple effects of one man's warped belief can, across decades, infect whole communities. We are not finished with Blackwood's map. We are only beginning to trace its lines. In the next section, we will open the ledger further, read passages of the journal, examine the language of the sacred abuse he wrote, and learn how words can forge prisons more effective than iron bars. A journal is supposed to be private, a place for confession, but Thomas Blackwood's journal was not a diary. It was a doctrine. Each entry read not as reflection but as command. He wasn't recording his thoughts, he was constructing scripture. The first volume begins with a declaration written in block letters across the opening page. The line must not break. The blood is chosen. Every womb is a covenant. Every seed a promise. Do you see what he's doing? He is turning incest into liturgy, abuse into ritual, fatherhood into priesthood. This is how language becomes a weapon. He knew that if you repeat a command long enough, if you etch it into walls, if you teach children to recite it like prayer, it stops being questioned. It becomes truth. The journals, 12 volumes in total, spanned nearly 3 decades. They were filled with schedules, pairings, punishments, and theology. And yet, the most chilling passages are not the logistical ones. It is the ritualistic language that binds them. Consider this line, repeated like a mantra. Blood is not corrupted by closeness. It is sanctified. That single sentence reframed the entire reality of the children. What would normally provoke disgust instead became sacred. And when you believe the unthinkable is holy, resistance collapses. Investigators who analyzed the journals noted a disturbing pattern. Each generation of children was assigned roles. Some daughters were vessels marked for reproduction. Some sons were wardens raised to enforce silence and obedience. Others were offerings, children whose deaths were rationalized as necessary sacrifices when birth defects or sickness made them unfit. The words stripped them of humanity and replaced them with function. A vessel does not have a name. An offering does not deserve grief. A warden does not question orders. This is the genius of dehumanization. Once you redefine people as roles, conscience evaporates. It is the same mechanism used in slavery, in concentration camps, in every machinery of systemic cruelty. The Blackwood journals were a miniature version of those vast engines, and the rituals reinforced it. Survivors described ceremonies conducted in the East Wing, white garments, oil rubbed on foreheads. prayers written by Thomas, recited in trembling unison. One girl remembered being told, "You are the mother of tomorrow's saviors. The world outside will burn, but your children will rise from the ash." Notice how that sounds. Not like abuse, but like prophecy. This is how language enslaves. It dresses horror in the robes of destiny. The journals also reveal how punishment was sanctified. A child who tried to run was recorded as wayward. The prescribed punishment, fasting, isolation, then re-instruction through scripture, reading while bound. One passage reads, "The flesh resists, but the spirit must be broken to obey. Better a body in pain than a soul in rebellion." To the children, this was not cruelty, it was salvation. They were told their pain was a gift, proof that they were being purified. Every scream became evidence that God was shaping them. Pause here and realize the genius of this system was not brute force. It was consent, manufactured through language. Blackwood didn't need iron chains when he could wrap their minds in sentences. And this is where the parallel widens again. Think beyond the farmhouse. Think of governments that rewrite textbooks to erase atrocities. Think of corporations that rename exploitation as opportunity. Think of regimes that call prisons re-education centers. It is the same principle. Change the language, and you change the limits of what people will accept. George Orwell warned us, if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. The Blackwood journals are proof. They corrupted thought so deeply that even decades later, survivors still spoke in his words, still recited his phrases, still saw themselves as vessels and wardens. One investigator in the 1970s described interviewing a woman in her 40s who had escaped the community. When asked about her childhood, she did not describe it as abuse. She said, "It was our calling. We were chosen. Outsiders could not understand the blessing." Even outside the compound, free for years, she still spoke in Blackwood's voice. That is the power of indoctrination. It outlives the indoctrinator. And here's the most unsettling discovery. The journals were not destroyed. They were preserved, seized by the state, locked in archives, labeled as evidence. But evidence is inert until someone reads it. Scholars, criminologists, even fringe cult leaders have requested access. Imagine what happens when those words are studied not as warning, but as blueprint. Because the doctrine did not die in 1915. It whispered forward. Some fragments leaked into fringe religious groups. Others inspired survivalist communities that saw themselves as chosen families, cut off from a corrupt world. Even today, certain phrases appear in obscure manifestos online, echoing Blackwood's scripture word for word. The contagion survives because words never truly die. They migrate. They evolve. And here's the question I need you to wrestle with. What doctrines are you carrying right now that were never yours? What phrases have been repeated so often, by parents, by schools, by governments, that you accept them as truth without question? Because that is the lesson of Blackwood. His bloodline was shaped not only by incest, but by incantation. His true legacy was not in bodies buried, but in words that still breathe. I want you to do something right now. In the comments, write this phrase 3 times. Words are chains. Write it until it feels heavy. Write it until you understand. Because if you don't master the words you inherit, the words will master you. The Blackwood journals are more than evidence of one man's crimes. They are a mirror showing us how any system, family, religion, government, can transmute atrocity into obedience simply by rewriting the dictionary of reality. And in the next descent, we will follow the trail of those words into the modern day. We will see how communities still breathe the doctrine, how descendants still walk among us, and how silence has allowed the bloodline to mutate into something far larger than one farmhouse in the woods. The journal is not closed. It is still being written. History likes to pretend that monsters die with the man, that when a patriarch is buried, his empire crumbles. But blood does not end at the grave. Words do not vanish when the page turns. The Blackwood story is proof. When silence protects a doctrine, it does not dissolve. It migrates. After the farmhouse raid in 1915 and the scattered investigations in the decades that followed, officials reassured the public that the Blackwood incident was contained. They spoke as though it was an isolated aberration, a freak tragedy in the mountains, but the archive tells a different story. Dozens of children were never accounted for. Records of births stopped abruptly. Witnesses spoke of wagons leaving at night, carrying the chosen to safe houses miles away. And remember the map? Multiple deeds across different states. The family didn't collapse. It dispersed. By the 1950s, whispers of closed families began surfacing in rural counties of Tennessee, Oregon, and New Mexico. Families who refused contact, kept their children out of school, and bore the same genetic markers: cleft palates, congenital deformities, abnormally high infant mortality. These weren't coincidences. These were echoes. In 1962, a county nurse in Arizona reported a disturbing case. 4 siblings, all under 10, brought in by an uncle for vaccinations. None had birth certificates. Their last name did not match the uncle's. Each displayed symptoms of malnutrition, yet their uncle insisted they were God's vessels. The nurse filed a report. The sheriff dismissed it. Silence prevailed. That silence was the doctrine's greatest shield. Just as in Thomas's time, institutions chose peace over disruption. Think about it. What judge in 1962 wanted to admit that a decades-old incest cult had survived government intervention? What politician wanted to admit that the Blackwood problem was never solved, only scattered? Denial became policy, and denial is the soil where corruption flourishes. By the 1970s, sociologists began noting pocket communities with eerily similar dynamics. Children born without records, extreme isolation, ritualized language. Survivors rescued from one such community in Oregon described themselves not as abused, but as preserved. They spoke of a prophecy that one day fire would consume the outside world and only their bloodline would endure. Does that sound familiar? It's word for word from Thomas's journal. The doctrine had survived intact for 60 years, but here's where the story sharpens. DNA. When forensic teams compared samples from survivors in Oregon to known Blackwood descendants in archives, the results were irrefutable. They were the same bloodline. The Blackwood curse had not ended in 1915. It had branched out, multiplying in silence. And today, in the 21st century, the trail is still visible if you know where to look. Online forums whisper of chosen families living off-grid, bound by sacred blood. Police blotters occasionally report welfare checks on isolated homesteads where children vanish from school rosters. Genealogist. Stumble across family trees that fold back on themselves with impossible regularity. And every so often, a phrase surfaces in a manifesto, a sermon, or a rambling online post lifted directly from the Blackwood scripture. The blood must not break. Now ask yourself, how does a phrase written by one man in a farmhouse over a century ago survive into the digital age? The answer is simple. Silence is contagious. When officials sealed the journals, when communities looked away, when neighbors refused to intervene, they created a vacuum. Into that vacuum, doctrine flows. Words travel further than wagons. And here is the part that should unsettle you most. You may have already passed a Blackwood descendant without knowing it. They no longer wear the sigil openly. They no longer chant in the East Wing. They blend, they adapt, they hide behind new surnames. But the bloodline remains. Some estimates suggest there could be hundreds of living descendants scattered across America, still carrying fragments of the doctrine, some loyal, some broken, some silent. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do you fight a ghost story that turns out to be flesh and blood? First, you recognize the pattern. The Blackwood doctrine survives because people convince themselves it is easier not to see, easier to dismiss children with no records as paperwork errors, easier to accept a sealed file than to demand its contents, easier to call these pockets eccentric instead of admitting the truth they are colonies of corruption, nourished by a century of silence. Second, you confront the danger of inheritance. It is not only DNA that passes down, it is belief. You may not be descended from Blackwood, but you are certainly carrying doctrines you never chose, ideas you inherited without consent. The question is, Which ones are shackles and which ones are wings? That is why I asked you in the last descent to write, "Words are chains." Now I ask you to write a new phrase in the comments 3 times. I break the silence. Do it as a ritual. Do it as a counter-incantation, because silence is the soil in which doctrines like Blackwood's thrive. If you do not break it, you are complicit in its survival. The Blackwood story is not just about incest in a farmhouse. It is about how corruption mutates, how it hides in plain sight, how silence fertilizes it across generations. And if you think this is just history, you are wrong. Every cult, every corrupt institution, every empire that rewrites its crimes in holy language, they are all using the same playbook Thomas Blackwood wrote. The bloodline is not dead, it adapted. And the real question is not whether they still exist. The question is how many other doctrines, political, religious, cultural, are doing the same thing right now, invisible until it's too late. In the next descent, we will go further. We will examine leaked transcripts from survivors who still whisper the chants today, explore the rituals that have survived into the modern day, and reveal how the Blackwood doctrine is mutating in digital spaces. Because corruption does not die, it reincarnates. And the Blackwood name is not just history, it is prophecy. The doctrine did not stay trapped in dusty journals, it breathes through living throats. Survivors still chant its lines, descendants still whisper its rituals, and in recent years, fragments of that secret world have leaked, through testimony, court transcripts, and even hidden forums on the internet. One survivor, known publicly only as Sarah, a pseudonym, testified in 1998 during a closed session of a family court. Her words were later leaked by an anonymous clerk. She said, "We were not allowed to call each other brother or sister. We were vessels and wardens. We did not celebrate birthdays because Father said time belongs to God. We marked our years by blood. The consecration happened in the East Room, always in white garments. We recited, 'The blood must not break, the seed must remain, the flesh is holy when it is given.' Do you hear it? Word for word, fragments of Thomas Blackwood's scripture, passed down for over 80 years, the children of children repeating the same poison, believing it sacred. Another testimony from a man rescued in Oregon in 2003 described how even play was ritualized. He said, "We played games, but the games were not ours. We were told to practice silence, to hold our breath, to hide in cupboards for hours. Father said we must learn to disappear. He called it training for the cleansing fire. We would sing the hiding song, 'Ashes fall, ashes stay, we are chosen, we don't decay.' A nursery rhyme, think about that. Words meant for laughter twisted into rehearsal for disappearance. Trauma disguised as innocence. That is how indoctrination cements itself, not through violence alone, but through the rewriting of childhood. Investigators also uncovered ritual calendars. Survivors described ceremonies timed with solstices and equinoxes. Always the same structure. Fasting, recitation, pairing of vessels and wardens, then silence. One chilling detail emerged. Children were forced to draw the family sigil, a crude, knot-like emblem, on paper before meals. They were told that food would poison them unless the sigil was drawn. Even the act of eating was chained to ritual. And here is where the digital age enters. In 2017, researchers at a cybercrime unit stumbled upon an obscure message board hidden on the dark web. Among its threads were discussions of sacred families and pure bloodlines. Buried inside were direct quotes from the Blackwood journals. Phrases like, "The weak are taken by God, only the strong remain." Members exchanged advice on raising children outside state oversight. They referred to outsiders as the decayed. This was not history. This was doctrine resurrected in real time, dressed in the anonymity of the internet. It is tempting to dismiss this as fringe madness, but remember, every empire begins in whispers. Every cult begins as a few people repeating forbidden words, and the danger lies in the repetition. Language is viral. If one household repeats a chant, it is delusion. If dozens repeat it, it becomes culture. If thousands repeat it, it becomes law. The transcripts also show how deeply survivors struggle even after escape. One woman, deprogrammed in therapy, admitted, "Sometimes I still feel guilt for eating without drawing the sigil. I know it's not true, but my stomach turns. It's like the curse still lives in me." Do you grasp the power of that? Decades after leaving, her body still obeyed rules written by a man dear but a century. That is how corruption outlives its creator, not in the flesh, but in reflex, in ritual, in the unconscious habits we inherit. And here's the part no one wants to admit. The Blackwood Doctrine is not unique. It is simply an extreme example of what all corrupt systems do. They take natural human needs, food, family, play, love, and wrap them in ritual chains. They make you believe that freedom will poison you, that obedience will save you. Whether in a farmhouse cult or a global empire, the mechanics are identical. That's why this story matters now. Because while the Blackwood family may seem like a grotesque outlier, the architecture of their control is everywhere. Ask yourself, what chants have you inherited? What rituals do you perform without question? What words control your appetite, your guilt, your silence? Because if you do not interrogate them, you are no different than a child in the East Wing drawing a sigil before eating. And here is your ritual for tonight. Write in the comments 3 times, "The chain breaks with me." Write it until it feels like a cut, because every repetition of their doctrine was a lock, and every repetition of your defiance is a key. You cannot undo the past, but you can prevent its reincarnation in your own life. In the next descent, we will examine the spiritual economy of control, how Blackwood's rituals mirror the broader ways institutions use guilt, purity, and sacrifice to bind entire populations. We will move from the farmhouse to the empire, from the journal to the textbook, from whispers in the East Wing to the chants in our daily lives. Because the doctrine is not dead, it has simply changed costume. And until you recognize the chant in your own mouth, you will never know which bloodline you truly serve. You think the Blackwood Doctrine was confined to a farmhouse in the Appalachian wilderness, but listen closely. That was only the training ground, a microcosm, an experiment in raw power, because once you strip away the incest, the secrecy, the grotesque rituals, you find the skeleton of something much larger, a system of obedience, and that system has been scaled to nations, to religions, to entire civilizations. Ask yourself, what was Blackwood's true innovation? It was not simply abuse. Abuse is everywhere. His true genius, if we dare call it that, was structure. He discovered how to convert biology into theology, how to take a natural instinct and make it a prison. He turned family into hierarchy. He turned food into obedience. He turned play into training. And once those foundations were built, he no longer needed chains. His daughters carried the chains inside them. That is the architecture of control, and you live inside it right now. Think of the slogans you were fed as a child. Clean your plate. Don't question authority. God sees everything. At the time, they seemed harmless, just cultural norms, but they trained your reflexes, just as Blackwood trained his children. He made them draw sigils before meals. We were made to recite pledges before school. Do you see the mirror? You were told you lived in a free world, but every morning your breath was synchronized with millions of others, chanting the same words, saluting the same flag. That is ritual, that is liturgy, and liturgy is always about control. Look at the ancient empires. Rome ruled not only through legions, but through ritual. Citizens poured wine, lit fires, marched in festivals. They believed they were celebrating culture, but in truth, they were being conditioned to obey, to fuse identity with empire. Blackwood told his children, "The world is corruption, only we are pure." Rome told its citizens, "The world is barbarian, only we are civilized." The same melody, only sung where. The different words, the medieval church perfected it further. They made guilt into a currency. You were born already corrupted, original sin, and only they could sell you the cure. Confession, indulgences, obedience to authority. Do you hear Blackwood again? You are impure until I cleanse you. His doctrine and theirs are indistinguishable in structure, and now, governments, corporations, media conglomerates, they chant the same tune. Consume this, or you are worthless. Believe this, or you are dangerous. Obey this, or you are unpatriotic. Rituals of purchase, rituals of identity, rituals of fear. Here is the hard truth. You are not as far from the Blackwood daughters as you think. Your cage is more elegant, your chains more polished, but the principle is the same. They control not just what you do, but what you fear to do. They control not just your body, but your reflex. Do you remember the story of the chained wife, Martha Blackwood, locked in the root cellar, starved, until she forgot how to speak rebellion? She became a symbol of silence. Every time you self-censor, every time you bite your tongue because it's safer, you are Martha in the cellar. Every time you justify corruption because that's just how things work, you are the sheriff who ignored the graves. Every time you repeat slogans without thought, you are the child drawing a sigil before eating. You were told these things are normal, but what if they are not? What if they are programming? Here's a sharper truth. The world is run by men who understand exactly what Thomas Blackwood discovered. Control is not about force. Force creates resistance. True control is about ritual. If you can ritualize obedience, you never need to enforce it. The subject will enforce it on themselves. Think of the digital age. Social platforms thrive on ritual. Scroll, like, repeat. The dopamine spike becomes a chain. You are rewarded for conformity, punished with silence for dissent. Blackwood had his children draw the family sigil. You draw symbols too. Thumbs up, hearts, hashtags. They are marks of belonging. They are marks of purity. And you are told, without them, you are nothing. Tell me, is that freedom? Or is it a refined, global version of the Blackwood experiment? Every empire, every church, every corporation has understood the same formula. Declare the world outside to be corrupt. Promise purity through obedience. Use ritual to bind obedience to survival. Repeat until the subject cannot distinguish obedience from identity. That is the machine. Blackwood ran it on 7 daughters. Empires run it on millions. Corporations run it on billions. And here's the revelation that will cut you open. You are in the machine, right now. So what do? You first recognize the architecture. You see the chant for what it is. You break the automatic reflex, and then you choose your own ritual. Because here's the final paradox. Ritual itself is not evil. Ritual is a weapon. The question is, who forged it? Blackwood forged his to enslave. Empires forged theirs to expand. But you can forge your own. Rituals of clarity, rituals of defiance, rituals that make you ungovernable. That is why you are here. Not just to learn about one degenerate family, not just to shudder at their graves, but to see the blueprint of control reflected in your own life, to recognize that what looks like history is a mirror, and if you have followed me this far, you already feel it. The unease, the recognition, the sense that something has been pulling your strings. That is the awakening. But awakening is only the beginning. The next step is action. The daughters who escaped carried scars, but they also carried knowledge. They told investigators what the chants were, what the rules were, what the rituals were. That testimony shattered the illusion. Your task is the same. Identify the chants in your own world and refuse to recite them. Break the sigil before the meal. Tear down the cellar in your own mind. Because until you do, the bloodline continues. Not biologically, but psychologically. Every generation that obeys without question is another descendant of Blackwood, whether they share his DNA or not. Now you know the secret, and once you know, you cannot unknow. The question is, will you act, or will you stay in the cellar? The deepest battlefield is not the farmhouse, not the courtroom, not even the empire. It is the human mind. If you understand nothing else, understand this. Thomas Blackwood's greatest weapon was not physical imprisonment. It was psychological colonization. He made his daughters carry the prison inside themselves. That is why the doctrine survives. Think about guilt. It is the most efficient leash ever invented. Force requires energy. Threats require presence. But guilt requires nothing. Once planted, it grows on its own, feeding on silence. You punish yourself even when the master is gone. That is why survivors decades later still feel sick for eating without drawing the sigil. The master is dead, but the leash is alive. Now look at shame. Shame is guilt with an audience. It is not just, I did wrong. It is, I am wrong, and everyone sees it. Blackwood understood this. He forced his daughters to label themselves vessels and wardens, stripping them of names. Identity itself became shame. When a vessel resisted, she was told, "Your body is cursed, only obedience makes you clean." That message burrowed deep. Survivors described how even showers decades later felt like rituals of cleansing, echoes of their indoctrination. And then there is purity, the most intoxicating lie of all. Every cult, every empire, every system of control uses purity as bait. Why? Because it gives suffering meaning. If you starve yourself, if you silence yourself, if you obey, you are told you are becoming clean, worthy, chosen. That illusion makes chains feel like wings. Blackwood promised his children purity through obedience. Empires promise citizens purity through patriotism. Religions promise purity through sacrifice. The details differ, but the structure is the same. Here is the mechanism. First, convince the subject they are corrupted. Second, convince them that only obedience can cleanse them. Third, make the rituals of obedience repeat until they fuse with instinct. Fourth, punish deviation not just with force but with shame. So the subject self-polices. That is how you create slaves who believe they are saints. That is how you colonize a mind so thoroughly it will defend its own captor. Consider how this plays out beyond the farmhouse. Advertisers whisper, "You are ugly, unworthy, incomplete." Then they offer the product as cleansing. Governments whisper, "You are unsafe, surrounded by threats." Then they offer surveillance as salvation. Religions whisper, "You are sinful, dirty, damned." Then they offer ritual and tithes as purification. Do you see it? Blackwood was not an aberration. He was a prophet of control, and the world followed his sermon in different clothes. But here's the most insidious part. Once these scripts are installed, they run even in solitude. Survivors describe hearing their father's voice years after escape. A woman said, "Sometimes I sit at a table, and before eating, I still think, did I draw the sigil? My hands twitch to make the sign. I know he's dead, but my body doesn't." That is not just memory. That is ritual written into muscle. The doctrine survives as reflex, and reflex is the hardest chain to break. So how do you break it? First, you must name it. Say the chant out loud and recognize it as programming, not truth. Second, you must replace it. A chain cannot be destroyed by silence. It must be replaced by a stronger ritual. This is why survivors heal when they create counter-rituals. Lighting a candle not as obedience but as defiance, speaking forbidden words in the mirror, even laughing in moments where silence once ruled. Every counter-ritual rewires the body. Here is your ritual for today. Take the words you were taught that made you feel small, dirty, guilty. Write them down, then burn the paper. Watch the smoke. Say aloud, "This is not mine." That act may feel foolish, but it is how chains snap. Not by intellectual argument, but by ritual stronger than the old one. Understand, shame thrives in silence. Purity thrives in secrecy. Guilt thrives in repetition. To break them, you must expose them, defy them, repeat defiance until it becomes instinct. Just as Blackwood's daughters were trained to obey, you must train yourself to rebel. Do not mistake rebellion for chaos. Rebellion, in its truest form, is reclamation of the self. It is saying, "I am not vessel, I am not warden, I am not consumer, I am not sinner by your definition." Rebellion is the moment you step out of the cellar and realize the door was always unlocked, but the memory of chains kept you kneeling. And here's the hidden danger. If you do not consciously rewrite your rituals, someone else will. The machine never stops looking for vessels. The empire never stops hungering for obedience. If you do not choose your chance, you will inherit theirs. That is why this doctrine matters now. Because it is not just about the Blackwood curse. It is about every system that colonizes the mind with guilt, shame, and purity. It is about recognizing that the enemy is not only out there, it is inside you, in the reflexes you never questioned. But awareness is a blade, and once you see the pattern, you can cut it. You can refuse the chant. You can build your own liturgy. The Blackwood daughters carried their scars, yes, but some also carried fire. They testified, they broke silence, they named the rituals, and in naming them, they cracked the curse. That is your task now, not to gawk at the horror as if it were distant, but to ask, what chants still live in me? What chains are written in my reflexes? And will I burn them, or will I pass them to my children? The battlefield is your mind. The war is now. Curses do not survive by magic. They survive by replication. Just as viruses require hosts, doctrines require vessels, and the Blackwood Doctrine, though seemingly bound to one bloodline, has found countless hosts across generations and borders. The mechanism is simple. Trauma becomes ritual, ritual becomes tradition, tradition becomes culture. And by the time culture solidifies, no one remembers the original trauma. Only the ritual remains. That is how corruption disguises itself as heritage. Look at the children of survivors. Some rejected Taotoen, he doctrine entirely, but others carried fragments unknowingly. A daughter who escaped the farmhouse once confessed, "I raised my own child never to question me. I hated when she asked why. One day I heard myself say, 'Because I said so.' And I froze. It was his voice. Do you see it? The curse mutates. It no longer requires the journal, the chants, the East Room. It survives in a tone of voice, in the way authority is asserted, in the reflex of silencing questions. The Blackwood father is dead, but through her, he spoke again. The same applies on a larger scale. Institutions reproduce their doctrines through rituals so subtle we call them normal. Schools enforce silence during pledges, but few ask why. Corporations demand loyalty rituals disguised as team culture. Governments demand ceremonies of obedience before granting rights. Each ritual is a seed, carried forward by repetition until it feels natural. That is how the Blackwood curse survives. Not as a family, but as a pattern of obedience woven into countless structures of power. Even online spaces have become incubators. The leaked dark web forum was not a glitch, it was a symptom. People drawn to the promise of purity, of chosen bloodlines, of escape from the corrupted world. In that echo chamber, the old chants were resurrected. They quoted Blackwood without even knowing his name. They believed they had discovered something new. In truth, they were repeating an old curse. Here lies the terrifying truth. The doctrine does not need to be remembered to survive. It only needs to be reenacted. Every time obedience replaces thought, every time purity replaces freedom, every time silence replaces truth, the curse breathes again. So what is left for us? Recognition. If trauma mutates into tradition, then the cure must be mutation in reverse. Trauma must be named, rituals must be exposed, tradition must be questioned, because when light enters, the doctrine cannot hide. Remember, silence is the root of propagation. The sheriff ignored the graves, and so the bloodline continued. Governments ignored survivors, and so the doctrine found new homes. Each time silence ruled, the curse replicated. That is why your voice matters. That is why testimony breaks chains. That is why ritual must be confronted. The question now is not, does the doctrine still exist? It does. The question is, will you recognize it when it wears a different mask? We have descended from the farmhouse into the empire, into the mind, into the generations that followed. Now we arrive at the end. But endings are not guaranteed. They must be chosen. The Blackwood curse is not just history. It is a mirror. And when you stare into it, you see yourself. The rituals you never questioned, the guilt you inherited, the purity you chased, the silence you defended. That is how curses survive, by hiding in your reflection. But here is the final revelation. Curses break not by forgetting, but by confronting. Forgetting only buries the rot deeper. Confrontation exposes it, names it, disarms it. The Blackwood daughters who survived did not destroy the doctrine by silence. They destroyed it by speech, by writing testimonies, by defying shame, by dragging secrets into daylight. Their courage was not in escape alone, but in articulation. They gave language to the unspeakable, and once spoken, it could not be hidden again. That is the model for you. Speak the unspeakable in your own life. Name the chants. Write down the reflexes that enslave you. Share them, even in whispers. Each word breaks the ritual of silence. Each act of truth-telling weakens the bloodline of control. Do not be fooled. The machine of obedience will never stop hunting for vessels. It will whisper that you are impure, unworthy, unsafe, sinful, unpatriotic, incomplete. It will demand your silence, your repetition, your ritual. But you now know the formula. You have seen the blueprint. You can refuse. Here is your final ritual. Tonight, sit in silence. Take a deep breath. Recall the chant that ruled you, maybe from family, from church, from nation, from culture. Write it down. Speak it aloud once, not as obedience, but as exposure. Then answer it with new words of your own choosing. Burn the paper, and when the ash rises, say, "The chain ends here." It will feel small, it will feel foolish, but so did every ritual at the beginning. Small rituals build empires. Small rituals also break them. This is not just the end of a story. It is the beginning of your inheritance. You inherit not the curse, but the choice, to repeat it or to end it, to pass it on or to bury it forever. And if enough of you choose to end it, not just in thought, but in action, not just in silence, but in testimony, then the curse dies, for real, not by fire, not by violence, but by exposure and refusal. The last words of this descent are yours, not mine, because the doctrine was always about silence, and the breaking must always be about speech. So I ask you, write below, out loud, 3 times. The chain breaks with me. Write it until you believe it. Write it until you feel the ash. Write it until the curse becomes nothing but a shadow in history. And when you do, remember, the doctrine has no power without vessels, and tonight you chose not to be one. This is the end of the Blackwood curse. If you want it to be,